Onto what? Onto the stage. Take it together.
Ayin l'Zion Sophia Od lavda tikvateinu Atikva shenadamayim Liotam chavshi be'arseinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim Liotam chavshi be'arseinu Eretz Zion Yerushalayim.
November 22nd, 1963. President John F. Kennedy, riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, is shot and killed. Millions witnessed it on television, watched the special bulletins on the news, or read it in the newspaper. Those who were standing there on that fateful day related their firsthand experience to TV and newspaper reporters. It shook our nation to its very core, an unforgettable experience for those who are old enough to remember. 52 years later, it feels like it happened yesterday. September 11th, 2001, in the most spectacular display of evil this country has ever witnessed. Terrorists crashed planes filled with passengers into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, right here in New York City. Thousands are killed at their desks or trying to flee the inferno, while others jump to their deaths as all hope is lost. At the same time, at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, more innocent Americans lose their lives on the most terrible day this country has ever experienced. Even if you weren't there to witness it, you surely know every detail. Almost 14 years later, it feels like it happened yesterday. Now imagine for a minute, a respected professor of history would stand up in front of you and tell you that these events never happened. In Dallas on that fateful day 52 years ago, what you saw was someone else, not the president. And he wasn't really shot, he just suffered a massive headache. The person who was pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital about an hour later was someone else. The funeral the whole world witnessed, complete with honor guard, a grieving family and nation, never happened. It was all made up or exaggerated. What happened on September 11, 2001 was just a fire in an office building, where an unfortunate few lost their lives. The events in Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania that day were totally unrelated. Don't believe what they're telling you. It's just a lie. It's what they want you to believe. Ladies and gentlemen, 70 years ago, a madman tried to wipe off the face of the earth all of our people, and he almost succeeded. The concentration camps were real. I know it because my dad spent time in 6 of them. And he has the numbers that burned on his arm to prove it, as do so many others. Some never made it that far, as they were killed in the villages of their birth, at gunpoint, and dumped in the very graves they were forced to dig. Some were tortured, some were killed, and some, like my dad, somehow, by the grace of God, survived. And because he survived, I stand before you today. Now, 70 years later, so-called professors of history want to deny that it ever happened. It's all just a big lie perpetrated by the Jewish people to gain the world's sympathy. It's what they want you to believe. Yes, a few thousand Jews may have been killed, but so were so many others. After all, there was a war going on. Let me tell you what's happening in the world today. Our nation and our history are being delegitimized. It's almost like we have no history. And the reason is very clear. When you deny a people's history, you deny a people's existence. There is nothing worse the enemies of the Jewish people can do today than to deny our history and to deny our identity. Ladies and gentlemen, the Shoah is as much a part of the history of who we are as the scrolls behind this ark. The reason why we come together each year in such numbers is not so much that we should all remember, but rather that we never forget. And whether we have parents or grandparents that survived the horrors of the worst act of evil perpetrated against our people, or even if we don't, all of us in this room understand how fragile our place in the world is today and how important this memory now becomes. Because for those who look to erase the memory of the 6 million souls we commemorate tonight, it is the first step to erasing all of us as well. Tonight, we're truly honored to have a Jewish hero among us. Professor Deborah Lipstadt understands that to allow a Holocaust denier to spout his wild revisionist history unchecked is as dangerous today as it was 70 years ago. The Jewish people don't have a monopoly in suffering, some say. What about slavery? What about all the other horrors perpetrated on humankind? The world's heard enough about the Holocaust. It's time to move on. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight because we are not moving on. Even today, it is inconceivable that 6 million people went to their deaths in the most horrible of circumstances, not because of what they did, but because of who they were. We will not move on because a part of those 6 million souls live in each and every one of us. We will not move on despite a world that now finds it acceptable to dust off all the old remnants of anti-Semitism that were never really put away. A world that seeks to delegitimize the state of Israel, our students on college campuses, Jews that walk the streets of Europe, and those that represent us at the United Nations. And if you walk away with anything tonight, it should be this. It is not just the Shoah that they seek to deny. It is not just the state of Israel. It is all of us sitting here tonight. By commemorating the Shoah, by returning here year after year, we are making a statement that every Jewish life is important. Whether on the streets of Europe, the college campuses across our country, the state of Israel, or here in our own community, we will never again allow anyone to deny our history, to deny our identity, or to deny our existence. We are not moving on. We will continue to fight, continue to remember, and continue to exist. May Hashem avenge the blood of these 6 million souls. Give us strength and courage to stand up and tell the world that, yes, this did happen, but it will never happen again.
Call upon the following individuals to light candles in memory of those who perished in the Shoah. Mrs. Bluma Gruber. Leo Malik. Gene Chapnick and Eddie Rosenblum. Sheila Weinstein and Celia Rupert. Helen Rosenstark and Debbie Orenbach. Aryeh and Yaffa Silverberg.
On Tisha B'Av afternoon at Mincha time, there's an insertion in the Tefillah at the prayer of Yerushalayim Yircha Berachamim Toshuv that speaks about the nechama that's to come to Tzion, to Yerushalayim. Nachem Hashem Elokeinu esavele Tzion ve'esavele Yerushalayim. And it talks about Libi, Libi al Chalaleihem, Mei al Chalaleihem. My heart, my innards are expressing the anguish of those that were destroyed. But like every tefillah of the Holocaust, of Tisha B'Av, it's not just crying on the past, but also hope for the future. Al Kain Tzion, v'martifke. Tzion will weep in bitterness. Yerushalayim titain kola. And Jerusalem will raise her voice in anguish. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ato Hashem, Ba'esh Hitzata, she was destroyed in fire. But U'Ba'esh Ato Osed Livnosa, you'll build her once again with the same fire. Menachem Tzion Uvoni Yerushalayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who consoles in the end Tzion and rebuilds Yerushalayim. And with the same fires that destroyed the Jewish people in the days of the Holocaust, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should quickly rebuild us and rekindle the fire of the Jewish people.
Nachem Hashem Elokeinu esavele Tzion Tzion b'martivka B'Yerushalayim titein kala B'Yerushalayim titein kala Al kein Tzion Tzion b'martivka Oy Tzion b'martivka B'Yerushalayim titein kala B'Yerushalayim titein kala Nachem Hashem Elokeinu Es Avei Tzion Es Avei Tzion Yes Yerushalayim Hey Libi, Libi, Libi Al Chalilehem Hey Meyai, Meyai Al Chalilehem Ahoy Ki Ato Hashem Bo'ei Shitzato Ki Ato Hashem Bo'ei Shitzato Uvaishato Sid Livnoso Uvaishato Sid Livnoso Ki Ato Hashem Bo'ei Shitzato Ki Ato Hashem Bo'ei Shitzato Uvaishato Sid Livnoso Menachem, Menachem Tzion Uvanei Yerushalayim.
As a kid growing up, my grandmother was my hero. Little did I know, as a young boy, what an amazing story she would have, what an amazing story she would share with me over the course of my childhood and as I got older. My grandmother was born on July 17, 1911, in Surlush, a small town in Czechoslovakia. She had a great childhood. Life was great. Her father had a wonderful job. And she grew up really, really with an amazing, amazing life. She had 4 siblings, and life was pretty good until the early 1940s. And when the Nazis came to town in 1944, she was placed in a ghetto for just a short 6 weeks. And between May 20th and June 3rd, 1944, her entire town was sent off to Auschwitz. They had no idea where they were going. They went on a train. And on the train ride, they were told they were going to Hungary for resettlement and everything was going to be good and life was going to be wonderful for them. But my great-grandfather looked out the window and saw the direction they were headed and said, we're not going to Hungary. He told my grandmother that they were headed to Auschwitz. And by 1944, everybody knew what that meant, heading to Auschwitz. My great-grandfather, as they were almost in Auschwitz, and he knew that his time with my grandmother was coming to an end, he turned to her and said, Rivkala, I want you to know one thing. I'm not going to make it. I won't survive. There's no chance for me. I'm an old man. But you're young, you're strong. There's a chance for you. If you should survive, I want you to promise me, swear to me, that you'll continue to be a Shomer Torah Mitzvos. You'll continue to be an observant Jew. Those are the last words my great-grandfather said to my grandmother. Well, her entire family, other than her sister, found Auschwitz to be their final resting place. She was only in Auschwitz for 3 days, and then she was moved with 200 other women to Riga. And from Riga, she would end up in Stutthof, another concentration camp in Germany. But as the Germans realized the war was over and they were headed to defeat, they didn't want those remaining Jews to be there. So they took the Jews and they marched them away from the Russians. And she marched for several days, maybe a little bit longer, in snow as high as her shoulders. And one night, she and her sister and 6 other girls said, we can't do this anymore. Let's try to make a run for it. And so, that night, they decided that they were going to hide out in a barn and wait, and hopefully the Germans and the Nazis would continue to move on, and they would be fine. In the morning, the owner of the farm went out into his barn and found them. He called the local Nazis, and they lined up the 8 girls. My grandmother was very, very, very fortunate. While the Nazis shot all 8 of the women, she got shot in the head and somehow survived. She laid on the ground, and when she regained her consciousness, so she went into another nearby barn, and she tried to recover in there. But again, she was found by another farmer. And he said to her, listen, you got to leave. If you're caught here, you're going to get into trouble. You can come into the house for just a few minutes. You could wash up, and then you have to leave. So she went in, and she got clean clothing from his wife. She washed up her wound. And as he was seeing her out, she screamed out, my Eva, my little daughter, which, by the way, she didn't have. To this day, she has no idea what the inspiration to lie like that was. And he felt so bad for her that he let her come back into the house and hide under a bed in the house for a few weeks. And eventually, she would survive, and she would meet back up with my grandfather. And Baruch Hashem, she is zochet to still be alive and get nachas from her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, who continue in the legacy of her father's parting words to her, the words of, Rivkala, hopefully you'll survive, and when you do, you'll continue to be a shomeret Torah mitzvos.
We shoot all the survivors and all the rabbanim. An average human being takes 23,000 breaths in one day. My father-in-law, Zalman Rosenberg, Alav Shalom, lived almost 93 years. That's well over 7 billion breaths. But tonight I want to speak only about 2 breaths that I saw him taking in his life. This bar of soap is manufactured in Bogota, Colombia, in South America, by Rosenberg brothers. When my father-in-law would smell this bar of soap, his face will fill with a broad smile. His heart and soul will be filled with joy and pride. This was not an ordinary bar of soap. He was born in 1919 in Yedinitz, which at that time was Romania. He was the youngest of 7, 6 brothers, 1 sister. And he was the youngest by 11 years. He had brothers that were 20 years older than him. One of his older brothers, was an adventurer and decided to go before the war to whatever happened to be Colombia, South America. The family manufactured soap in Romania, and they were successful at it. He was the little brother. He wasn't taken seriously, and he had trivial, boring jobs. But he was always very curious, and he loved to hide in the chemical plant and play around and make formulas. For all his family, this was just child's play, a little boy playing chemist. In 1940, the Russians took over that area of Romania and were going to deport the Jews to Siberia. The family fled quickly to Czernowitz, Bukovina, which was still under Romanian rule. And they left everything behind. To survive, they started some kind of small factory in a basement, but the war was raging on. There was no raw materials, no fats to make oil. Baby brother Zalman had a new formula. He came up with this idea of making soap using sunflower seed oil. And they were able to manage to sell a few bars of soap for food. In 1941, the Romanian police under Antonescu took over the town, ransacked their houses and their businesses, and they were set to send them to concentration camps. However, by the grace of God, the wife of the commander of that police unit happened to be a chemist who was working at a soap factory. And there were no raw materials. How were the Rosenbergs making soap? So they started wondering. And my father-in-law stood up and said, now 21 years old, I will trade you this formula to make soap if you let my family go. And as he said, he used to say, I made a deal with the devil. And he did. And supposedly, they made a deal. He had to stay behind to guarantee the deal. He showed him how to make soap using the sunflower seed oil. He remained behind, not knowing ever if his family was really alive and if they ever kept the deal. His family also not knowing his fate. After reviewing the formula, he was sent to labor camps. He was mining stones for roads. He witnessed many people died in uncontrolled explosions. Others died of illness, the cold. Many were executed cold-blooded for not performing to task. He himself got sick. He had terrible fever one day, blisters in his throat as he described, obviously no medication. He was a charming young man, and he befriended the cook. So he asked him for mamaliga, which was a cornmeal in Romania, very hot cereal. He said, make it as boiling as you can. He burned his throat inside out to break the blisters. And he survived. Not only did he survive, but he saved his parents' lives and the entire family. After the war, he did whatever he could to survive, selling shoes, cigarettes. He met his wife, they married in 1947, and they tried to get out of Romania. Of course, it was communist Romania, and they couldn't. In 1950, finally, after years, they were able to leave. They ended up in Israel for a year, and then he found out his family was alive in South America, in Colombia. He went to Colombia, he reunited with his family, and he reunited with his baby, this bar of soap. He took a deep breath at this bar of soap, and to him, it smelled like defiance, like determination. This soap smells like survival. It smells like intelligence and wisdom. It smells so much like courage and strength. That's just one breath out of 7 billion breaths. The second breath that I witnessed him take was in January 2005. My brother-in-law and family had made Aliyah to Eretz Israel. We traveled in January 2005 to celebrate my nephew's bar mitzvah. I remember pushing his wheelchair, getting out of the new modern Ben Gurion airport. My father-in-law looked around, he nodded his head several times, and he took a very deep breath and said to me, Hitler imach shemo. I know he sees this, and he's turning and turning and turning in whatever place in Gehenna he's now. That breath filled his soul, like the Besamim filled the extra soul when Shabbat departs. It was a breath of triumph and victory, a breath of accomplishment and redemption. He lived with us the last 7 years of his life permanently at home. No better life lesson for us and our children to see a survivor live and survive and appreciate family, appreciate food, and the basic life necessities that we so often take for granted. He kept making experiments and formulas. This time, not to make soap, but he made different foods and recipes. Many of you here enjoyed his soups and his food. He's buried in Nahariya, Israel, next to my mother-in-law. His matzeva reads, Orech Yamim Asviyehu V'Arehu V'Shuati. With long life, I will satisfy him, and I will show him my salvation. Long life, well, after what he went through, 93 years. Not long enough for us. We miss him. I will satisfy him. He appreciated and was satisfied when he took a deep breath and smelled the soap and what it represented and what it meant. And when he smelled the air of Eretz Yisrael. I will show him my salvation. Well, Baruch Hashem, he witnessed firsthand the rebirth and flourishing of Eretz Israel. In his merit and in the merit of all the survivors and all those who perished in the Shoah, may Hashem bless us all with Orech Yamim, with long lives, and we should really see the final Yeshua, Ve'arei Yeshuati.
November 9th, 1938. Kristallnacht. Berlin, Germany. Herr Wolf Margulies, the Jew. Let me see him right now. And out from the corner of the bedroom, little 11-year-old Manfred Margulies is peering out, scared out of his wits, as he sees his father, Wolf Margulies, being taken by two Nazis, a tall guy and a not so tall guy. And the tall guy is dressed in the full Nazi regalia and grabs Wolf Margulies. You dirty Jew, you are coming with me now. And as the last time that Manfred Margulies saw Wolf Margulies, the tall Nazi pulls out a piece of paper and says to Rosa Margulies, his mother, by the way, is there a young boy here named Manfred Margulies? And little Manfred Margulies, who's sneaking a look over here, hides. And Rosa doesn't know what to say. And shaking, she says, yes, little Manfred Margulies is here. And the tall Nazi, dressed beautifully in that Nazi regalia, says, tomorrow there is an action for the boys. And if Manfred Margulies is not here, I may not find him. And he leaves with Wolf Margulies. The next day, little Manfred Margulies is next door at the very nice Christian neighbor. 30 days later, little Manfred Margulies, age 11, along with 9 other first cousins, are put on a train with one adult, his mother, and they're taken to the border of Germany and Holland for the very first Kindertransport out of Germany. And Manfred is allowed to take just one little suitcase, half the size of this, He's allowed to take only a few items. And before Manfred Margulies was put on that train, little 11-year-old Manfred Margulies somehow snuck into the only surviving shul in Berlin that was nestled between two apartment buildings where high-ranking Nazis were living, so that shul wasn't burned. And somehow he snuck in and took out a few precious items. And when he was taken to the border of Holland, the youngest of those 10, his mother said to him, and this was his bar mitzvah, Manfred, run, don't look back. And Manfred ran, and he ran, and he ran, and he ran into Holland, and he ran into England, and then he ran to the United States. And he kept running for the rest of his life. And because of that damn Nazi officer who took away Wolf Margulies, in an odd bit of ironic history and perhaps hashgacha, this Wolf Margulies, Robert Wolf Margulies, can show you the items that my father took from the only surviving shul in Berlin that night, his tallis and his siddur.
Aleile ani b'chia, Aleile ki rachak mimeni. Hay menachem eshiv nafshi. Hayu vanai shalmei ki gavarayeh hayaleileh ani b'chiyah menachem eshiv nafshi. Hayu vanai shamei ki gavarayeh. Na 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 na. Na 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 ki gavarayeh hayaleileh ani b'chiyah
Dr. Deborah Lipstadt is the Roth Professor of Modern Jewish and Holocaust Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She has excelled with brilliant academic achievement for 46 years in the field of Jewish history and Holocaust studies, particularly for the publication of her most prominent work, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. In our daily prayers, we say that the ministering angels of the Almighty come in different categories. Kulam ahuvim, kulam berurim, they are all beloved, and they are all distinguished. I believe that also applies to those who are given a sacred mission to study the Holocaust and to publish and to teach the memories of the 6 million. However, there's another group. We say that in our prayers, kulam giborim, and there's a group of those who are heroic. That's a small cadre of individuals who carry on and wage a battle against falsification of the Holocaust, protecting the memory and the integrity of every one of the 6 billion. Dvorah Lipstadt, Dr. Lipstadt is certainly one of the Kulam Giborim of our times. Holocaust survivors use an affectionate term, a term of endearment for Dr. Lipstadt. They call her with the Yiddish inflection, Unsere Devira, our Deborah. It's my honor and privilege, on behalf of my colleagues, to give you this evening, Unsere Devira, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you. There's only one word to respond to that very gracious introduction, and it's a word you know, term you know, in a setting you know, katonti. And I thank you for it. I actually come tonight to this very powerful and moving ceremony, and I say that having attended and been participated in many, many Yemei HaShoah ceremonies in many different settings, and this is, I don't know if one says alit al kulam, but it certainly surpasses many that I've seen. To do two things: to talk to you about Holocaust denial in general, and to tell you a story, my own story of what happened to me as a result of publishing my book, Denying the Holocaust, a lawsuit which I know many of you are familiar with, but to share with you some of the details. But first, a couple of comments about Holocaust denial, and then I'll set the story within that. I don't want to be here yelling Oi Gewalt. There's much to yell Oi Gewalt about. But when it comes to Holocaust denial, I would argue that it's not a clear and present danger. There are far more people visiting Holocaust museums worldwide in our own capital, Yad Vashem, England, at the London War Museum, and many, many other places than are engaged in Holocaust denial. What I do believe it is, I'm not saying let's be complacent, I wouldn't have spent so much time studying it and talking about it if I felt that, but sometimes I think we yell Oi Gewalt too fast, dear me, and Chicken Little, you know the story of Chicken Little, dear me, the sky is falling, and when the sky really falls, some people don't pay attention because we've said it too much. I do believe that Holocaust denial is a clear and future danger. Particularly, and we were privileged tonight to see the candles lit by survivors, and I wish you all bis 120, but there's the tyranny of the biological clock, and every year when I come to these ceremonies, as I'm sure you noticed too, our precious survivors are frailer and older, and we treasure their presence, but we know the nature of the biological time clock. So what will happen when there aren't people to speak in the first person singular and say, this is my story, as you told me as we were waiting for the evening to begin, this is my story, this is what happened to me. And that is one of the things I worry about. And it was thinking, when I didn't think Holocaust denial was such a problem when I sat down actually to begin my research. But I had been approached by two of the leading professors of Holocaust history, both of whom were teachers at the Hebrew University. One has since passed away, Yisrael Gutman Zal, who was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Yehuda Bauer, one of the great historians of the Holocaust. They called me once to their office when I was in Jerusalem, up on Har HaTzofim, and they said to me, Deborah, we think your next book should be about Holocaust denial. And I said, you take those guys seriously? You think I should spend time writing about them? They said, yes, we do, and we think you should too. And when two people of that stature say, take something serious, you don't just slough it off. So thinking it would be a short excursion into another topic, I would learn something about it, I would try to understand it, because to me it was at that point more flat earth, worthy of flat earth theory, which no one of any seriousness takes seriously, than a true danger. But when two people of this stature say they were concerned, you don't, as I said, just slough it off. Well, I wrote the book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, and it was really an examination of who these people were and what were their arguments, and why did anybody take them seriously? Because the Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. How could anybody take them seriously? And what I found, in essence, was that at its core, and this is a bit like bringing coals to Newcastle, as Shakespeare would say. It's not something that's going to surprise anyone in this audience, that at its heart, it was naught but a form of anti-Semitism. It's also a form of racism in the way it's used by racists, but it's at its heart, first and foremost, a form of anti-Semitism. Let me explain what I mean by that, though it's probably obvious, but I want to expand on that a little bit. What are the basic arguments that Holocaust deniers make? Well, first, and this was an argument made, I mentioned this in the book, by my then nemesis, David Irving, a Brit, who was, let me tell you a little about him, and then I'm going to come back to the arguments that deniers make. I mentioned in the book that one of the world's leading Holocaust deniers was a man named David Irving. Some people think with those names, maybe he's Jewish, not the least bit. He traces his lineage back to Robert the Bruce, or Bruce the Robert, one of the old Anglo, nicht von unserer, not one of our people. But David Irving was not a professor of history, had no academic standing, but was known as a writer of historical works. And there are writers of historical works who've written many historical works who don't have academic positions. And he wrote many books, and he had a very vivid way of writing. His knowledge of German is outstanding, and he would find documents. People would give him diaries and letters, and all his books, even before he became a denier, all his books had a very strong right-wing, far right-wing sort of shift, in which he would argue the Nazis weren't so bad, and the Allies weren't so good, and whatever happened to the Jews, well, they probably had some of it coming to them. And he was one of the first to write on the bombing of Dresden, again, looking for an Allied wrong to write about. Of course, he way expanded and exaggerated what happened at Dresden, but that's for another time. And so I wrote in the book that just a few lines of, maybe if you cut it and paste it all together, it's a page, something like that. I said that he was one of the most dangerous of deniers, because when he became a denier in the 80s. As his star was beginning to wane a little bit, he glumped onto Holocaust denial because he found a group of, kivyachol Hasidim, and I don't mean that, I'm not a misnagid, I don't mean to describe him, but, followers, people who would follow him because he brought to the world of Holocaust denial a certain legitimacy. His books were reviewed in the New York Times. His books were reviewed in Times Literary Supplement, London Review of Books. Not his books on denial, but his preceding books. So when he became a denier, many people said, well, his denial, of course, is crazy. That's stupid. But his other stuff is good. It's what I call the yes-but syndrome, which I always find is backwards. One should have said, yes, he's a denier, but that means that I can't, or turn around. Yes, he writes interesting things, but he's a denier. Therefore, I don't believe anything else he says. It should have cast suspicion on everything he said instead of taking what he said about denial and sort of putting it to the side. Well, the book came out, and it made this argument that Holocaust denial was this form of anti-Semitism, because what I argued in the book, and here we go back to what deniers argue that, and David Irving was at the heart of these arguments. He comes out of the closet, so to speak, as a denier in the late 80s, but he's already cavorting with them earlier in the 80s. And he either repeats their arguments or creates their arguments. And what his argument, and by extension the major arguments of most Holocaust deniers, is A, there was no plan by Hitler to kill the Jews. That many Jews may have died, quote unquote, listen to the language, not killed, died, but there was no plan to annihilate the Jewish people. B, some Jews, we have documents, and some show that Jews died, but if they did, or even if they were killed like the Einsatzgruppen reports, the reports from the mobile killing units on the Eastern Front, which list the number of Jewish victims, They were killed because they were partisans, they were criminals, they deserved to be killed. Number 3 or 4, the gas chambers are a scientific impossibility. Irving, and by extension, all deniers put a great emphasis on the gas chambers because in much of the world, the gas chambers become emblematic, even though over 1 million Jews were killed by shooting, by bullets, but the gas chambers become emblematic of the marriage of modernity and mass killings, and modernity and genocide. We had genocide before, but never with this use of modern technology, with these purposely built gas chambers, special ovens to cremate many bodies at the same time, etc. So they want to argue that they try to argue that the gas chambers are a scientific impossibility. And the point, and this brings us back to the point I made a moment ago about being at its heart anti-Semitism, the question you would ask, of course, is, well, why would the Jews make this up? What's, quote unquote, quotation marks, in it for them? Now, generally, when we ask, what did the Jews, and I put this in very big quotation marks, get out of the Holocaust, the answer not normally given is what? State of Israel. And what's the second thing? Reparations, which is a fancy word for money. Well, first of all, the state of Israel, none of you should be giving the answer the state of Israel. The state of Israel did not emerge from the Holocaust. In 1936, long before there was even a thought of a Holocaust in the minds of the Nazis, much less anybody else, the Peel Commission, the British Peel Commission, talked about the need for some sort of Jewish entity and Arab entity in what was Palestine, the Yishuv. And so there would have been something. And if the state of Israel had been a direct result of the Shoah, it would have been created 1945, 1946, 1947, not 1948. The State of Israel is created because the British pull out because of the chaos there, and they can't control it. And so I think it's very dangerous to give that notion that the only reason there's a State of Israel is because of the Shoah, because it raises all sorts of other contemporary issues. That's just as a tangential remark, but I think it's something worth thinking about. But if you go back to those traditional answers that are given, State of Israel and money, and look at them as sort of thematic answers, they fit right into the traditional stereotypes of anti-Semitism. What are the traditional stereotypes? Every stereotype, every prejudicial stereotype has things that are familiar. If I'm going to be prejudicial towards Italians, I'm going to talk about mafioso connections. If I'm going to be prejudicial towards homosexuals, I'm going to talk about weak-limbed and effeminate. If I'm going to be prejudicial towards African Americans, I'm going to talk shiftless and lazy. That's in quotation marks. But those are the stereotypes associated with them. And if I'm going to engage in anti-Semitic stereotyping, I'm going to talk about two elements. Money, Jews' love of money, control of money, want of money, etc., and their unscrupulous ways of trying to get power. That's why when we hear about the pro-Israel lobby, our backs go up in a way that, you know, when the tobacco industry hears about the tobacco lobby, their backs don't go up. Because we know that lobby has implications for people as if it's once again Jews doing something sinister. Both these stereotypes, money and this illegitimate use of power by a small group against the majority to do something for their own benefit, even if it's at the cost of the majority, have their roots in the New Testament version of the death of Jesus and how that has been taught. That the Jews killed him because he chased the money changers out of the temple. And they did this to the Jews. Now, everybody in the story is Jewish, of course, except the Romans who actually killed him, but don't confuse me with the details, you know. I don't want them, but in other words, it's, again, they did this to that innocent for their own purposes. If you go back to blood libel charges, poisoning of the wells, all the traditional anti-Semitic charges have these two elements. Jews doing evil for their own purposes, usually with a financial and powerful gain, even though they're a small group poised against the majority. So when you come back to the Holocaust deniers and you say, well, why would the Jews go to this effort to make up these stories, to plant these documents, etc.? It's hard to do all that. It's a lot of effort. Aha, for these two things, that's how Jews are. So that explanation of Jews did it for Israel and for reparations, for money, resonates with anybody who has been exposed to anti-Semitism. They make sense to anybody who has been exposed to this anti-Semitic notion. So I argued that in the book. I wrote the book. The book was published. It was published in this country. It got very positive reviews, bought by Penguin UK, and is published in England. So when the book came out in England, once the book was published in England, I became subject to British law because I was doing business in England. And then he told the publisher, and he went to court, went to the legal offices, and filed a suit against my publisher, Penguin UK, and me for libeling him and calling him a Holocaust denier. Now, when I got the word that he was denying he's a Holocaust denier, I thought this was quite ludicrous. Because this is a man who had said things in speeches in Toronto. I think he gave a speech, and he said, I'm going to sink the battleship Auschwitz. And more people died in Senator Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than died in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. And other such things which were designed to annoy, designed to anger, designed to make fun of, designed to belittle, and clearly were Holocaust denial. So I found it very strange that he was doing this. But there was a catch, which I didn't first know, but I quickly learned. And that is that British libel law, and my guess is in an audience such as this, we have one or two lawyers who probably know this. We probably have more than one or two lawyers, but at least one or two who know this. That British libel law is the opposite, the mirror image of American libel law. In America, if I say you libeled me when you wrote this about me, or you slandered me when you said this about me, I have to prove that you lied. In Britain, it's the exact opposite. If I say you libeled me when you said this about me, you, as the author of the words, have to prove the truth of what you said. By the way, Israeli libel law is very similar to this. So the onus, the burden of proof, is on the creator of the words to prove the truth of what she said, and not on the person who feels they've been harmed to prove the untruth. Why is this important, and why am I stressing this? Because it severely constricted my options. If I hadn't fought, which many people told me I was wasting my time, and including very serious and very well-respected Holocaust scholars, who felt, you're a good scholar, why are you wasting your time on this Narishkeit? They didn't use that word, but that's what they meant. No one, I said, because if I don't fight it, he'll win automatically. If I didn't show up in court to fight it, he would win by default. Wouldn't have had to prove a thing, because it's burdens on me to prove. I don't show up, I'm conceding that he's right, he wins. Ipso facto, then his David Irving version of the Holocaust I would be declared to have libeled him by calling him a Holocaust denier. So ipso facto, his version of the Holocaust would then be seen to be correct because he's not a denier, and it's all those things I listed to you a moment ago. So I knew I had to take this on seriously. I was very lucky. A friend of mine, a Brit, who works for a Jewish organization that fights anti-Semitism and racism, et cetera, called me and he said, Deborah, I know about the case because the paper's been filed and he's talked about it publicly. And my suggestion, you need a lawyer. I said, yes, I need a British lawyer, because at that point, Penguin's lawyer was the insurance company's lawyers, and insurance companies always don't have Their main objective is not to get the truth, but their main objective is, of course, to protect their coffers. So I said, no, I think I should have my own lawyer. He said, well, there's a young man in England who is considered very, very smart and very, very clever. And in British parlance, those are two separate things. And when you want a lawyer, you want someone who's smart and you want someone who's clever. And he cannot, unlike, he said, no British Jew abides anti-Semitism, but he's very willing to fight it directly. He is known as being by those people who like him, and women will resonate to this, by those people who like him, he's known as being very assertive. By those who don't like him, he's known as being aggressive. It's true. I spoke to him, and he said that if you contacted him, he would be more than happy to represent you pro bono if necessary. So having heard all the important words, smart, clever, assertive, pro bono, you don't walk on my line. I said, what's his name? And my friend said his name is Anthony Julius. The name rang a bell. And then suddenly I sort of went through my mental Rolodex, PDA. I began thinking, well, who's Anthony Julius? Anthony Julius. And then I remembered that not long before, I had read a number of reviews in all the major journals of a book written about T.S. Eliot and anti-Semitism and literary form criticism, arguing, of course, that T.S. Eliot was not an anti-Semite by chance, happened to say things, but he really believed it, and that the world of the critics, the world of literary criticism, had given him a free pass on his anti-Semitism. Again, yes, but he doesn't really mean it. Yes, but look at the rest of the corpus of his work, etc. And this author, Anthony Julius, had said, no, you should take it very seriously. And all the reviews mentioned the fact that this author was a lawyer, specializing in press and libel law, who, while working full-time as a lawyer, had gone back to university to get his PhD because he was bored with just doing law. And he did it, continuing to work full-time as a lawyer because he had 4 kids and, just couldn't stop working, etc. And when he was profiled in the New Yorker and asked about it, he said, look, some of my fellow lawyers play golf on Wednesday. I went to graduate school. What's the big deal? And then his book was published by Cambridge University Press without changing a comma. When you're in the world of academics and you hear that someone's handling 2 jobs and doing them so well, it makes an impression on you. So I said this to my friend about this lawyer, and my friend began to laugh. He was laughing at me. I had said something that he found terribly amusing. And when he stopped laughing, I didn't know what it was. I wasn't going to pursue it. I said, I thought of something else about Anthony Julius. I said, isn't he also Princess Diana's divorce lawyer? And my friend said, that's why I'm laughing, Deborah. You're the only one in the world who would say, author of a book on T.S. Eliot and anti-Semitism and literary form criticism, and also Princess Diana's lawyer. Well, as soon as Anthony came into the case, I'd like to say we began to develop our strategy. He developed it. I sat and said, he's very smart. He knows what he's doing. I think it's good. But now, revisionist history. I can engage my own little bit of revisionist history. But we agreed from the get-go. We agreed, and we have stayed very close friends and compatriots and colleagues ever since. The trial was in 2000, and this all began in '96, so it's close to 20 years that we've been friends. Should this go to court? Should this issue go to court? We were going to try, first of all, not to prevent it from going to court. And the way we were going to try to prevent it from going to court was by the best defense is a good offense, by really fighting back full steam, by showing him we were taking this very seriously, we weren't just sloughing this off, and he was going up against a formidable enemy. By demanding papers, by filing papers, by hiring researchers, et cetera, et cetera. B, should this go to court, we would try our darndest. We didn't have control. We were only 50% of the people represented. He was part of the game too. But that this should not become a did the Holocaust happen trial. Because that would not, even if we had won one of those, it would not have been a victory. Because you don't have Did World War II happen? Trials. You don't have, did Korean War happen? Did Civil War happen? Do you need a trial to prove the Holocaust happened? And we felt, no, you don't. And we didn't want to be part of something that perpetuated that notion, even if we would win. And one of the ways we decided that we would do that is two things, two of the ways. One, we would follow his footnotes back to the sources. And instead of presenting a case which showed the Holocaust happened, we would take as our main body of evidence his work, follow his footnotes back to the sources, show that he lied, show that he distorted, show that he denied, show that he didn't act as a responsible historian, A. B, again, if we had to go into court, we would bring witnesses, but we would not bring survivors as witnesses. And many survivors had come forward offering to testify, and we said, no, we're not using survivors as witnesses. They were hurt, they were insulted, and we couldn't explain to them why. But now I can, of course, say so. There were a number of reasons. First of all, Irving doesn't deny, and deniers don't deny, that Jews were in concentration camps. They may have been in difficult conditions, but what they deny is that there was a purposeful plan of annihilation, of what is often said extermination. I don't like that word because you usually use that word for vermin, and that's using lingo of the oppressors, to murder all the Jews of Europe and actually beyond, Libya, Rhodes, Crete, etc. And what we needed was witnesses who actually saw the killing process, Sonderkommandos, Jews who worked in the gas chambers, etc. And there were very few, if any, of those alive and able to testify. That was one reason. The other reason was that David Irving was representing himself. He was a litigant in person. He was pro se. And we didn't want to put a Holocaust survivor in the witness box to be cross-examined by a man whose objective we assumed would be to confuse them, to humiliate them, to say, oh, you say you arrived on this day in Auschwitz and your parents were killed that day. How could it be? Here I have a piece of paper which shows the gas chambers weren't operating that day. Maybe they were killed the next day. Maybe you got the day wrong. Maybe, but to look for every way to humiliate them and throw them off guard. The other reason was, this was the year 2000, and we also looked to the future. And we said, we want to show that you don't need, while we treasure witnesses who can say, I was there and tell you their story personally, as some of which we heard this evening from their children and grandchildren, but we want to show that you can prove this story without a problem with documents. That this is a documented, as I say, the Holocaust has a dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. So we assembled a dream team of historians, and we had them literally top historians in the world: Richard Evans, Christopher Browning, Robert Jan van Pelt, Peter Longerich. And we had them, as I said earlier, follow the footnotes back to the sources to find how he lied, how he distorted. A number of people this evening mentioned Kristallnacht. Irving has this great fixation with Hitler, and one of the things he wants to do is pull any shame and any responsibility away from Hitler. So he wants to show that Kristallnacht was this spontaneous uprising, and when Hitler heard about it, he says, a telex was sent out from Hitler's headquarters. They were all in Munich that night because it was the anniversary of the Nazi putsch from the 20s. And they were all gathered there. When they heard what was happening, Hitler ordered that a telex go out, stop the madness. He was livid with rage, and at 1:26 in the morning, stopped the madness. Well, if you look at we found the actual telex that went out, and if you look at the telex, it doesn't say stop the madness. It says arson against Jewish shops and the like should be halted. Why? Because of the dangers, as someone referred to earlier, of fire. Entire fire departments couldn't control the fires. So if a synagogue went up in fire, what would happen is, here comes my drawer of water. Thank you. that the fire departments couldn't control the fires. So the order went out, stop arson against Jewish shops and the like, Jewish institutions. He took and the like and put it to modify arson. He said, stop the madness. And we did this over and over again. I'll give you another example. Someone mentioned Hungary tonight. As you probably know, the Hungarians, who were very active in instituting their own anti-Semitic laws, did not agree to the deportation of the Jews. Admiral Horthy, who was the head of the Hungarian government, would not let the Jews be deported. He was not kind to the Jews, but he did not let them be deported. And the Germans, who were their allies, began to pressure them. And they had a meeting. Hitler and Foreign Minister Ribbentrop had a meeting with Admiral Horthy, the head of the Hungarian government. It was a two-day meeting, April 15th and 16th, 1943. And there were notes to the meeting, so we know exactly what was taken, a stenographic record. And on the first day, Horthy said, well, what do you expect me to do? I've done all this against the Jews. Do you expect me to deport them, that they should die like beasts in the field? And Hitler says, no, that's not necessary. On the second day, Horthy asks again, and Hitler Ribbentrop says the Jews should be taken to camps and allowed to die, should be killed or taken to camps and allowed to die. And Hitler launches into a bloodthirsty harangue. The Jews are like tuberculous bacilli, and if you don't kill them, they will infect others, and even the youngest animal that carries a certain bacillus has to be put down, so the youngest Jew has to be put down. It's blood dripping from every word. It's a prescription for murder. How does Irving treat this in his book? He doesn't deny it, but he reverses the sequence. So he has the bloodthirsty harangue, only parts of it on the first day. And then he says, when Horthy asks on the second day, what do you expect me to do, to deport the Jews, that they should die like beasts in the field? He says, no, that's not necessary. So by reversing sequence, he gives you a very different impression of what happened at that meeting. He takes Ribbentrop's statement and he buries it in a footnote. And then the third thing that he does is in his author's voice, when you write a book, as I'm sure the people in this audience who have done, you try to assume what's going to be, makashe l'rashi, makashe to my readers. What's going to be hard for my readers to understand that I have to tell them? So Irving is saying, my readers will want to know why Hitler was so anxious to get the Jews out of Budapest, where most of them were, and of course many were in the Carpathian Mountains as well. And he says, in his author's voice, this, of course, was the time of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, where 50,000 Jews in the ghetto at Warsaw were rising up against the Nazis with arms supplied to them by troops retreating from the east. Now, first of all, the only troops pulling back from the east were German troops. I can assure you they were not stopping at the ghetto to drop off their arms with the Jews, A. B, more importantly, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising started on the 19th. This meeting was on the 15th and 16th. It wasn't like it was a scheduled event and Hitler said, oh, in 2 days we're having the Warsaw. They were completely surprised by it. So the Warsaw Ghetto uprising could have had no impact on his desire to get the Jews out of Budapest and other large concentrations in Hungary. So it's a trick on the reader. And we did this over and over again to show what he did and to prove he was not a historian. So I've given you a legal piece, I've given you the historical piece, and many more. We showed the court, it was a bench trial, not a jury trial, but we showed the judge, and I think we gave him 35 different examples of this kind of manipulation. Because what we wanted to show, this wasn't a mistake. We weren't cherry-picking his mistakes, but we were showing a continuous pattern where every time he mentioned the Nazis, it was a whitewash, the Jews were worse, it was their responsibility, and it always went, because we would show this, and he'd say, oh, I made a mistake, and we would show this repeatedly. The third piece I want to touch on very briefly is the personal piece. The courtroom was filled every day, certainly with his supporters, but also many of my friends heard, because the news reporters many reporters would say it was filled with this neo-Nazi and this one and that one. Some friends of mine began to show up from all around the world, first from England and then from Israel and then from different continents, from this country, from South America, etc. So much so that my lawyers, who started out by asking what cities are represented, by the end were saying, what continents are your friends from this day? But also the place was also filled, of course, with survivors, some of whom came from Israel, some of whom came from other places, and many from the United Kingdom, from London. And one day, and cousins of mine had come from Israel, and they got there early because you had to get online to get into the courtroom. And when I got to the courtroom that day, I was, of course, allowed to go in right away. My cousin waylaid me, and she said, Deborah, there's a survivor here who needs to talk to you. So I said, Brenda, I can't take care of other, I'm holding it together. She said, no, she has something she has to give you. So I went over to this person, and as nicely as I could, I said, yes, my cousin tells me you have something to give me, and she handed me a piece of paper. And on the piece of paper were a list of names, 10 names, 12 names, maybe more than that. And they all had either the same last name or a middle name. So it would be Yaakov Horowitz, David Horowitz, Sarah Horowitz, Siegel or something, but the Horowitz family. It's not the family, but I'm just saying. And next to each name was this precise date of birth. And in most cases, when it said date of death, a question mark. Sometimes there was a precise date. It was clearly her family who had died. Someone gives you that kind of list. You don't just glance over. You read each name. But what do you say? Anything you're going to say is going to sound paltry. I'm sorry, but nothing to say. So I gave it back to her, and with, I guess, my body language, tried to express my emotions, my sympathy, my empathy, whatever words fail in this kind of a situation, as they so often do when talking about this subject. And she got very angry, and she said, no, this is my evidence. You must have this. And that day, I took that piece of paper, and it sat on in front of me where I sat in the courtroom with those names there, and I very often brought it to court after that. The other thing that we showed the court, I want to touch on this briefly also, because I mentioned it. I said that Holocaust deniers are very often racist. And racists, white supremacists, you go to any white supremacist website, I don't suggest you do, but leave that to me. And the ADL, I don't. But they love Holocaust denial. Why? Because they say Nazi science was proving the superiority of the white race. And of course, in their eyes, Jews are not white, but also the inferiority of people of color, black people. And so the Holocaust myth was created to delegitimize Nazi science. And David Irving would do that kind of stuff all the time. We got tapes of his speeches through this discovery process where he's talking to his followers in some hotel room someplace, and he says, I just came back from a very nice vacation in England on the coast, but I turned on the television, the BBC News, and I saw one of them reading our news to us. And his audience laughs hysterically. He says, it's our news. We should be reading it. He says, this is what I would accept. Dinner-jacketed gentlemen reading the important news. On the BBC, very often, when it was the radio, they would wear dinner jackets. Gay vase, I don't know. Women reading the unimportant news. And then he named a very prominent British newscaster whose parents happened to come from Jamaica. He's a black man. And he said, and this man's name, and he said, reading the news of criminals and drug busts. And his audience laughed hysterically. And when we read this out in court, Irving turned to the judge. Irving was in the witness box, and my barrister was reading it out. He said, oh, your lordship, they're trying to make me sound like I'm a racist. I wasn't talking about blacks. I was talking about women. It's our news. It's true. But he did this over and over again, disparaging Jews, and of course disparaging Jews, but also disparaging people of color. We won. We won a very commanding victory. And it was on every point except one small point, but every point having to do with Holocaust denial. The judge, in his judgment, called David Irving's version of history tendacious, false, made up, and many other words as well, but all point to the same thing, that he's a liar. Called him a Holocaust denier, called him an anti-Semite, called him a racist, and then said something very important. And he does this on purpose. It's not a mistake. Effectively, I would argue, without taking credit, because this really goes to the witnesses and the lawyers who fought this case, that this case was the turning point in what I call hardcore Holocaust denial. The arguments, no gas chambers, no plan to kill the Jews. What we have today, and I don't have time to go into this, is more softcore Holocaust denial. And usually hardcore and softcore are used with pornography, and I use that knowingly because I think Holocaust denial is a pornographic thing, and pornographic in terms of history, it's a double dying for Jews, it's a rewriting of history, it's an anti-Semitic, all the things. Today we have softcore, where we have either everything is a Holocaust or we have the genocide of the Palestinians, and you can, however you might feel about the way the Palestinians are treated, and I say this often, I say this to people who feel they're genuinely being mistreated, there's no way in any manner, shape, or form to argue it's a genocide. It's a rewriting of history, a turning on its head, or what you have in the former communist bloc countries of an attempt to say, well, the Stalin crimes were the same as the Holocaust, and if you were fighting, if you were in the resistance, you were a Jew in the resistance, fighting with the communists and communist resistance group, you were a perpetrator. And it's a turning on its head of the Holocaust. But I think what my trial did do, is it was the beginning of the death knell. It hasn't gone away, and it can resurrect itself. Anti-Semitism has a way of doing that, but concurrently of hardcore Holocaust denial. We showed how there is no basis for it. So for the moment, but the softcore stuff is growing and festering, and I don't have to belabor that point because I think you know it. I'd like to close by speaking one last category, and that's personally. The day we won, the courtroom it was in the largest courtroom in the High Court of Justice, right next to QB7, where the Leon Uris trial took place. And the courtroom was people were online at 6:30 in the morning for a 10 o'clock session. And the judge, uncharacteristically, usually judges don't do this. They call up the judge's clerk, Clark, as it said in English, calls up the lawyer, said, come pick up the judgment, here's the judgment, I'm finished. But he sat in courtroom and he read out for 2 hours his judgment. It's a 300-page judgment, it's online, there's a website, an Emory-run website, www.HDOT, Holocaust Denial on Trial.org. It's an Emory website with its own portal because they're afraid they make it through Emory, I'll bring down the whole university. My friends will, my friends will bring down the whole university. On the first day of the trial, when I came out of the courtroom, I wasn't giving testimony. I wanted to, but the lawyers felt it was not necessary and I shouldn't. But they said, because you're not giving testimony, we don't want you to talk to the reporters. We don't want the judge to say she won't testify in your courtroom, but she's talking on the BBC. And I have friends who say the greatest miracle of this whole fight was that they told me this 3 years earlier, not to talk to the press, that for those 4 years, and at least 4 years, I kept my mouth shut. They said that they don't understand. I think they're right. I don't understand it either. But I came out on that first day, and there was David Irving outside the courtroom having a mini press conference. And I was suddenly surrounded by the reporter who was covering it for the New York Times, and the reporter was covering it for the LA Times, and National Public Radio, and Reuters, and AP, et cetera, et cetera. And they all had, microphones. Deborah, give us something. Say something. And they pointed to David Irving having this mini press conference, and it was just galling to me. And one of my lawyers walked out of the room, Anthony's junior partner, and he saw what was happening. He made a beeline to where I was. He said, Deborah, don't say anything. And I said, I'll say something unimportant. And he said, you don't get it. We were having this fight in front of all the reporters. And he said, anything you say today will be important. Nothing you say will be unimportant. I said, let me say something. And while we're having this fight, I noticed out of the corner of my eye somebody sort of pushing through the reporters. I thought maybe it was another reporter or something. But somehow, through that gaggle of reporters, a small woman emerged, dressed very sensibly for a winter day in England. sweater and a little wool hat pulled over her hair, etc. But she had her hand out, and she was waving it. And people pulled back, thinking maybe there was something not quite right or whatever. And I just stood there because I had a sense of what was coming. I don't remember consciously having it, but I feel that I must have. She came close to me, and she pulled up her arm, and she pointed at the numbers on her arm, and she said, "You are our witness. You are fighting for us." That's all I remember her saying. I don't know whether she went on to say, and don't mess up, but I sort of heard that, and I turned to my lawyer, and I said, I don't have to say anything, when we left the courtroom. On the day of the victory, of course, we came out of the courtroom, and it was chaos, and the Brits were coming over and saying, "Well done, madam," and Americans were coming over and high-fiving. I like the high fives. Someone had gotten my mother on the phone and handed me the phone, and she said, and the people who were here who knew both my parents said, "Your father would have been very, very proud." And then all of a sudden, and it was a real time of great joy. We had worked on this at that point for 5 years. We didn't know 2 years of appeals coming, etc. I felt someone tugging at my arm, and it was the woman. And she said, "Thank you." And I indicated to the lawyers, "Let's leave," and we left the courtroom. I did press conferences and all sorts of things that day, and I came home that night, of course, to hundreds of emails and letters and notes. And I'd like to end by just sort of sharing some of them with you. There were many thank you notes, thank you with names of relatives and names of people who had passed away. But one of the most perplexing was, it said, "Shoftim Daled Tet." I had already shipped back all my books. I didn't have anything. I called. It was too late to call. This is how late it was in London. It was too late to call New York. So I called the West Coast. And I got a friend on the phone. I said, "Congratulations." I said, "Wonderful. Tell me about it." I said, "Just go get a Tanakh and tell me what Shoftim Daled Tet is." Some of you may know. It's from Shirat. It's from the story of Devorah. Ki biyad Hashem ki biyad Isha yimkor Hashem et Rosh Sisra. Because God will deliver the head of Sisra into the hands of a woman. And another friend wrote me, and she said, "Your 2 favorite psukim from the Tanakh have come to life." Because a number of my friends know that I have 2 favorite psukim. And maybe you're not supposed to have favorite psukim, but I have 2 favorite psukim. The first one is from the story of Avraham. I think it's Bereshit Yud-Chet, where Avraham, after meeting the angels, and God says, "Shall I hide from Avraham what I'm going to do?" It's a story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah. And when Abraham, of course, is told by God what he plans to do, he does something that's just terrific. And I think it has shaped who we are as a people. He begins to argue with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And he uses the Kadosh Baruch Hu's own justice system against him. And he says, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat." Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? But he doesn't leave it at there. He says, "Chalila lecha," which can only be translated, God forbid, it can't be that you shouldn't do justice. And someone said, justice was done. And the same for, but Deborah, I also know you have a second favorite verse, and it comes not from the Torah, but comes from Ketuvim, from Megillat Esther. My middle name is Esther, named after someone who passed away in the Shoah, a relative by marriage. And it's when Mordecai sends a message to Esther that she's got to go to the king. And she says, "I can't, I haven't been summoned," and Mordecai has no patience for that. And he sends back, he says, "Al tidami b'nafshech," don't think you're going to be saved, and your people will go. What will happen to everyone happened to you too. But then he goes on to say, if you don't do it, someone else will do it. If I hadn't fought David Irving, I thank you for the wonderful calling me of a hero, but if I hadn't fought him, probably someone else would have. But then it's the next phrase. Mi yodea im le'et kazot higat lamalchut. Who knows if not for this very reason, Mordecai says to Esther, you became queen. Now, I don't consider being sued by the world's leading Holocaust denier and one of the leading anti-Semites being a queen of anything except maybe the courtroom. But who knows if not for this reason I grew up in the home that I grew up in influenced by a very influential rabbi who I know influenced other people in this room. Rabbi Emanuel Rackman had the privilege of davening at the Jewish Center with Rabbi Young and Rabbi Lamb. My parents picked shuls based on the rabbis. So, remember that. But they wanted rabbis who were role models for their children. People who were involved in the world, who understood that you didn't stand silently by. Mi yodea im le'et kazot. And I was humbled by it. And more so, even a few days later, I was invited by then Prime Minister of Israel, Barak, to come to Israel. And I went with my mother. And even, it already happened before I went to Israel. It happened in England. It happened when I came back to Atlanta. And it certainly happened on the streets of Yerushalayim. I would be stopped by survivors. Sometimes the survivors in Israel would say, "At Devora mi Anglia, are you Deborah from England?" And I would say yes, and they would stop me and thank me. I went to a cousin's, while I was in Israel, cousin's bar mitzvah, and a number of survivors came and thanked me. And everyone likes to be thanked, especially if they've done something which has taken a lot of effort and gone to a lot of trouble. But somehow it felt very strange and uncomfortable, and still does, to be thanked by a survivor who lost her whole family, who spent time in a camp, is thanking me for fighting a lawsuit when I had the best lawyers, you could have. It just didn't seem right. And I thought about it, and I was thought back, and I realized it reminded me of something. It comes again from the Torah. When Moshe grows up and he comes out of the palace, and the first thing he sees, of course, is the Egyptian beating the Jew, the Israelite, and it says, "Vayifen ko vako vayar ki ein ish." He looked this way and that, and he saw there was no one there. And it sounds a little strange. When he's looking around, no one's looking. Okay, now I'll be brave. Doesn't sound like the man who's then going to go on to be approached by God in the bush and see the only person to see God, panim o panim, etc., etc. And Nechama Leibowitz does a wonderful thing with that pasuk. She says, "Vayar ki ein ish la'asot mishpat." He looked here and there, and he saw there was no person. The makom she'ein anashim mishtadel liyot ish, where there are no menshim, be a mensch. There was no one to do justice. No one, not ish, but an ish la'asot mishpat, someone to stand up and do justice. And for the survivors who had so suffered, not just from what they had suffered at the hand of the Nazis, but the feeling of silence of the rest of the world. At this point, not an ish, but an isha who had stood up to bring them justice. I stood up because I had no choice, but nonetheless, that was the case. But still, nonetheless, though I understood it, their thanks made me uncomfortable. And with this, I close. I thought more about it, and I thought of the fact that we have, as all of you know, a concept in our tradition of gemilut chasadim, of acts of loving kindness. Hachnasat orchim, bikur cholim, welcoming strangers, visiting the sick, etc. And every act of gemilut chasadim is known by its name. Its name describes what it is. You don't have to, please explain to me what bikur cholim is. It's obvious. It's known from its name. Except one. And that's taking care of the dead. That is called chesed shel emet, the most genuine kind of chesed we can do. And as my father had taught me, it's called that because that's the time he was a lifelong member of Chevrei Kadisha, wherever he lived, because that's when we come closest to emulating the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Because when we visit someone who's sick, we don't do it thinking, oh, I'm going to be sick and they're going to visit me. But that's what it calls to be in a community. I'll take care of you because who knows, someday, or I'll welcome guests to my Pesach Seder because my kids may be on the other side of the world someday and hopefully some will invite them. But the one time when the person you're doing the chesed for can't in any way pay you back is when you're doing chesed shel emet, when you're taking care of the dead. And it's we can't pay back the Kadosh Baruch Hu for the life we've been given, the blessings we've been given, so that's why it is genuine chesed. And I feel very privileged. It may sound strange to talk about a lawsuit which took 7 years of my life, cost millions of dollars. Thank God there were people who gave, and there was a defense fund. But now it looks back. It was a victory and all that, but it was difficult and it was painful. But I feel very lucky. More than lucky, I feel actually blessed that I had the chance for those years to stand up for people who didn't have the privilege, the zechut, the luck, the blessing to survive or who survived, but who don't have the chance to stand up for these people. So as I look back on those years, even though they were difficult, I'm very thankful for it. Thank you very much.
Shir Hamalos LeDavid, V'le'Adonai Shehaya Lanu Yom Adonai Yisrael. V'le'Adonai Shehaya Lanu B'kum Aleinu Adam. Azai Chayim B'launu B'charos V'apam Banu. Azai Hamayim B'shrafunu Nachla Avar Al Nafshenu. Azai Avar Al Nafshenu Hamayim Hazidonim. Baruch Adonai Shalom Sanu Teref Shinehem. Nafshenu Kitforn Blanta and Pach Yoshim. Pachten Shrav Nachman Lanu. Ezrin Misheba and Ayoseh Shemayim V'aretz.
Richard Silber will lead us in the recitation of the Kaddish. He was raised in a home of Holocaust survivors. Sarah Adel Silber, Allah Shalom, Yibodel L'chaim Avram Yosef Silber makes his residence in Yerushalayim. He was part of our community for so many years. Anyone present who has at least one parent deceased is welcome to follow Richard in the recitation of this Kaddish for the 6 million. Please rise.
Yiskadal v'yiskadash shmei rabba v'yimamat v'vorach rusei v'yamlech malchusei v'chayechon v'meichon v'chaydechol beis Yisrael v'agala uvzman kariv v'imru amen Yehei shmei rabba mevarach le'olam omei omaya Yisparach v'yishtabach v'yispoah v'yisroman v'yisnasei v'yisadar v'yisaleh v'yisalal shmei dukutsha berchu leila min kol berchasa v'shirasa tushbechasa v'nechamasa damiram b'yama v'imru amen Yehei Shlomo Rabba min Shemaya, v'chaim aleinu v'al Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromov, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al Yisrael v'imru amen.
Before we close tonight's program, I'd like to thank the young people that helped us tonight with distributing the printed programs, Avital Paneth, Shani Spiegel, Aliana Liebman, and Josh Weinstein. I don't want to take away from the importance of tonight's program with a personal note, so I'll just quickly say that Bert Drachman and I, who are both leaving the program tonight, would like to express our hakaras hatov to all those who have attended this event each year and to all who have contributed to making it the success that it has been. The Anim Yamin tonight will include the words of the song, Someday We Will All Be Together. It is our fervent wish that by attending this program year after year and by keeping this memory alive, Hashem will unite us with those who lost their lives under the most tragic circumstances, Al Kiddush Hashem, so that truly, someday, we will all be together.
I think it would be remiss on the part of the shul and personally, having been on the committee for the last 3 years, not to take a moment to thank Lester and Bert and Marty Schmidt for the tremendous amount of work they have done on this program for in excess of 20 years. The tribute to those who we are remembering, who we are honoring tonight, is that all of you are here. Many years ago, this was a much smaller program. It was during the week. It was held at the ECC. We did not fill the shul like we did tonight. I think it is a tribute to all of those who are here, who are honoring memory of those who perished, to honoring those who survived. But it is also, I want to thank Lester, Bert, and Marty for the tremendous work they have done over the years of making this program what it is tonight. We cannot thank you enough.
They learned every in a dark, frigid cellar. Alone, just a small group of men.
When in rushed the soldiers and led them all away, the flame of Torah flickered on that day.
So many tears, so much sorrow. The pain has lasted thousands of years, but soon we'll stop crying. The cruelty will end, and Melech HaMoshiach will descend.
Someday we will all be together. Someday we'll be sheltered and warm. Never will we have to express any fear. Our scars and our wounds will disappear. Avram and Yitzchak will be there to greet us. Yaakov and his sons will stand by and smile. Moshe Rabbeinu will lead us once again in Yerushalayim be'ezras Hashem.
We learn every day and we daven. We ask Hashem, please bring those old times back.
Oh, we know that you're listening. He always does, it's true. For I received a promise, and so have you.
That Hashem will lead us out of this hole. It won't be too much longer, we know. And then together we'll all dive in, and together we will sing.
We praise and thank Hashem for everything. Oh, someday we will all be together. Someday we'll be sheltered and warm. Never will we have to express any fear. Our scars and our wounds will disappear. V'af al pi sheyismamei ha'im kol zeh achake lo b'chol yom sheyavo b'chol yom sheyavo v'yaf al pi sheyismamei ha'im kol zeh achake lo b'chol yom sheyavo